Welcome back, everyone, to the Stay Introverted Podcast. I am your co-host, Jay Coleman.
I'm your other co-host, Steph Laffey.
And as always, we want to start off by just thanking you for joining us on this podcasting journey with two introverts just shooting the breeze and talking stuff. Right, Steph?
That's right.
Awesome.
I never know how to answer that.
Yes, thank you. That was very reassuring. I appreciate that. It was awesome. But today we have a very special guest. I want you to help me welcome a good friend of the show, Mr. Benjamin France. And I tell all of our guests we have no clapper yet, but once you get a budget, we will invest in one so that you can have some sort of welcoming sound. But for now, why don't you say hi to the people and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Like we were talking about before we started recording, this is my first time guesting. So I'm a little bit nervous, even though I have my own podcast, because I've never been on this side of it. I just kind of talk to myself and record it. So this is a little different. But like you said, my name is Benjamin France, or people can call me Ben. I'm pretty laid back, honestly. And I am a licensed professional counselor, which is, I guess, the technical term for what most people would call a therapist or mental health professional, that sort of thing. I work with a lot of people that are dealing with anxiety issues because I've had more than my own share of struggles with those over the years. And I still have what I kind of call a complicated relationship with anxiety, although it's gotten a lot healthier over the years. And I also work with a lot of people that find themselves in that place where they've kind of quote unquote done the thing on what they're supposed to do with life, but it feels like something's missing. Like they've got the house, they've got the job, or they've got kids or whatever, but something feels like it's not quite there. So trying to mine down to what's really going on there and what is the thing that's missing that makes life feel more fulfilling. And I'm also, I guess,
love it.
I should say, a musician and a creative, and regardless of my verbosity, I don't know if that's a word, my verboseness of talking right now, pretty introverted and very, very ADD. So yeah, I guess that's me.
That's awesome.
I love it.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your own podcast for the folks out there?
Thank you. Well, I have a podcast called Diary of an Anxious Therapist. And it is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. My whole reason to start that was because I have struggled with anxiety over the years. And so I wanted to give people kind of a behind the scenes look on what that's looked like for me, but also hopefully to give people some helpful and useful information on how they can possibly cope with their anxiety and how they can maybe use some of the stumbling that I've done over the years with that as maybe ways to avoid some of the pains or some of the difficulties and struggles that I've had over the years. So it's I try to do episodes every other week. I am not expert level at banking a bunch of episodes ahead because I am so ADD. So it's not uncommon for me to be looking at the calendar going, oh, tomorrow's Tuesday and episodes due out on Thursday. I better record something. but it's pretty much a solo podcast, at least at this point, although I've got some friends in the mental health community, fellow counselors that I'm looking at having guests in the future on it. So.
Oh, how cool. I've listened to every single episode.
That's awesome. Thank you, Steph.
I'm obsessed. Like every time I see Diary of an Anxious Therapist has a new episode out, I stop everything and I'm like, all right, gotta listen to this because it's so good. Like I have learned so much, so many coping mechanisms, and so I just am so grateful that you've put yourself out there and that you've created something that's so helpful and therapeutic.
Thank you. That's all. I'm getting a little choked up with you saying. I really appreciate that, but that's awesome. That's all my whole goal with that podcast has been if I could maybe make one person's life a little bit easier and they struggle a little bit less, then it's worth all the time I put into it. So that is wonderful to hear. I really appreciate that.
Of course. And what is that like being an anxious therapist? Like what is
It's tricky is maybe a good word for it. I think maybe the best way I can kind of describe it is to kind of give a little bit of a peek behind the curtains. And especially when I first started as a therapist, I've been in the mental health field for about a decade now, if you include like practicums and internships when I was working on my master's degree. And I can remember countless times to where I would get in a room with a client or clients, because I initially thought I was going to focus on couples counseling, which sounded like a really good idea. And then kind of in hindsight, I'm kind of like, maybe not. But, and I could feel that anxiety coming up in me. And then that could really, early on in my career, that could affect the sessions. And it was because I wasn't doing the work for myself that I needed to do to have myself grounded in a good place. But it was also because I am naturally the person that kind of really keys in on other people's emotions. So if someone was really anxious, it's really easy for me to feel that anxiety too. So what I've done over the years is I've learned that I have to make my self-care a priority. That's something that they teach you in school when you're going for a mental health degree. And it sounds great on paper, but it wasn't the most natural thing for me to do because I've always been kind of the helper and you take care of everybody else type of person. So what I've learned over the years is the more that I do that, the more that I take time for meditation, the more that I take time to get out into nature, to relax, to do things that are rejuvenating and that feel good to me, then the more level ground I'm on, it makes it a lot easier for me to be in that level open space that I need to be when I'm with a client then.
Okay. So I would imagine that boundaries are probably very important for you.
Very much so. Yes. Yes. And that comes from that type of energy that I carry. Also, that comes from the place that, as I always say kind of jokingly, in a former life, I worked in corporate America. And a lot of those boundaries got very loose, to put it lightly, because I didn't feel like I had really any control over this situation. I kind of had to do what I was told in order to make the paycheck to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
And so I that's made me over the years become much more firm on my boundaries. And now that I work completely for myself, there are certain things that are just not negotiable because I know if I'm going to do good work, I have to be coming from a good place to do that.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to touch on that a little bit later in this episode because I work in corporate America still. And I would love to get some of your insights about how people like me and some of our people in our community can kind of instill some of the things that you've learned, even though we are still in that corporate America machine, if you will. But Jay, I'm gonna shut up for a second and because I know you had some questions that you wanted to pick Ben's brain about.
Yes, I guess I wanted to know a little bit more about kind of how anxiety manifests itself. Because it took me a while to kind of realize, quote unquote, what was wrong with me. I remember growing up feeling weird because either in a social setting or just being around people and people I don't know, thinking that they think something's wrong with me. And I remember like feeling physically weird or sweating a lot or like it felt like it felt like there was like 100 pins hitting me on the top of my head. So I guess I want to know is anxiety something that's more mental, more physical, or like some sort of combination?
Oh, that's a great question, Jay. I think that my short answer, if I wanted to be silly and quippy, is yes. but the more in-depth answer is it's really both. I think there's a lot of debate in the mental health community as to whether anxiety originates with our thoughts and then that causes physical symptoms to kind of manifest, or if the physical symptoms come up and then that causes us to feel anxious. So I think everybody experiences it differently to an extent. There's some commonalities there, but just because, for instance, myself, I first would notice that my stomach feels a little upset, and then that make me start feeling anxious because my mind would start racing towards, oh, well, what if I have to run to the restroom or something like that? That's going to be so embarrassing. People are going to notice that, and so on and so forth. For me, it manifests that way a lot of times, but that doesn't mean for somebody else it might not be the thoughts first and then the body. But it's very much both. Once again, I always use myself as the best example because that's the best way I can think to kind of relate that. I've always been kind of the high-strung, nervous energy person. Even as a little kid, I was that person that like was constantly going. And probably my ADD had something to do with that, which I'm at the age I wasn't diagnosed with ADD, but I'm sure that played a role in that as well. But so as I started getting older and I started becoming more aware of social situations and becoming more aware of people's opinions of me, that's where anxiety really started creeping in, even though I couldn't have labeled it as that at that point. But it's exactly what you were talking about. It's this, are people going to think I'm weird? Are people not going to like me? Or people, whatever stories we tell ourselves in our head. And for me, once that loop would start, and I'm not going to say would start, does start, because it still does sometimes. I don't know if I'd ever say that anybody really ever gets over anxiety. I think we just kind of change our relationship with it. But once that loop would start for me, then it would just start going and going and going. And so it would go from well, what if I have to run to the restroom? That's going to be embarrassing. People don't like me. Then it would go to, well, if people don't like me, they may not want me to come out again. They may say things about me and blah, 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 and then you just get that chatter in your head. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And it would just go,
Yes.
it would go. And so that's how it manifested in me. And I feel like I could just keep going and going and going. But does that answer that part of your question and help me more with what would be more something that you would like to know, like how I dealt with it or that sort of thing?
Oh, definitely. That definitely
Okay.
helps. So I guess my next question would be, you kind of addressed it, is how, knowing that everyone is different, how do you kind of deal with anxiety?
Okay, perfect. So for me, it's and for all my clients that I work with, because I work from kind of the same place of my personal experience when I'm trying to help people. And that feels gross saying help people, because I have this a little bit of, I'm the expert, meaning that I don't
Right.
feel that way. So when I say help people, my internal voice goes, "Who are you to say you can help people?" But it starts with, for me, it starts with recognition, and it starts with being in like a grounded place and recognizing what's going on. Meaning that if your anxiety is like a lot of people's anxiety, is like my anxiety, you can go 0 to 60 real fast. You can go from feeling like everything's okay to, oh my gosh, now I'm really up in my head about things. So I think it has to start with recognition of what are some signs that my anxiety is starting to amp up. How do I know I'm starting to get anxious? Because sometimes we may not be aware of that. Some people may not, it may feel like it just comes out of the blue. Like one minute I'm feeling fine, and the next minute I'm like, oh, I've got to get out of this place. There's too many people here. I feel nervous, so on and so forth. But what I've learned from years of doing this, both myself and with clients, is that if we step back and look, you usually will start to get some signs that, hey, something was starting to feel a little out of balance. I was starting to feel a little nervous. I was starting to feel a little anxious. It might be I get a little twinge in my stomach, or it might be that my breath's getting a little shallower, or I'm breathing a little faster, or it might be that my thoughts are racing, whatever it is. But it starts with the awareness of that for me and for my clients. And so we do a lot of work, and I do a lot of work, I should say I do a lot of work with people around getting in touch with your body, getting in touch with your awareness, and getting in touch with what's going on in you right now. So like if you and I were to sit here right now, Jay, and we were just talking, I might, if hypothetically, if we were in a session, I might ask you a question, something like, what are you feeling right now? What does your body feel like? Does it feel relaxed? Does it feel tense? How does your stomach feel? Are you noticing anything weird there? How does your back feel? Does it feel tight? Does it feel restricted? Those sorts of things. I try to get people where they start to recognize in their body what's going on, because like I said, from my experience, that is often, if not every time, often a telltale sign that something's feeling a little out of balance. Our body lets us know that something's feeling a little out of balance. So then what I would do from there, and what I've spent a lot of work on myself, is that this probably going to sound a little bit icky, but I try to go to a situation of what's something that would make me anxious, mentally play that out, so then I can get more familiar with that. Okay, how do I know I'm feeling anxious? How do I know anxiety is coming up? Meaning if I've got a client who has to give a presentation at work and they really don't like public speaking and it makes them super nervous, and that was me for a long time and kind of still is in some ways.
Same.
Yeah, absolutely. That whole, just staring at the blank space, and you hear all the things like, picture everybody without their clothes on, which is, I was like, that's gross, one, and two, that doesn't help me any. But
that just makes me giggle.
yeah, exactly. Which makes me feel like they're gonna be wondering what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Or wondering what I'm laughing about. So what I do with a client is I would say, okay, if you've got this presentation coming up and you're feeling, and anxiety is a thing for you, and you're feeling really anxious and you're starting to feel kind of panicky about it, let's try to go to that place. Let's sit here and let's visualize this. I'd have them close their eyes. And I'd say, imagine yourself walking up to the podium and stepping at the podium. Stop for a minute, take a breath. Imagine looking out at the crowd of people there that you have to talk to. Now, what are you feeling? What do you feel coming up? And a lot of times people will get some general sense that, oh, I just feel nervous. So then I try to go a little bit more than, okay, well, what does nervous feel like? And that's where I go into the bodily sensations. Do you feel like your hands are shaking? Do your hands feel cold? Do you feel like you're sweating? These sorts of things. And it's trying to get that awareness so we can recognize when our body is starting to tell us something feels out of balance, something feels threatening. And then once we recognize that, then you can move on to, okay, now what do I do to stop myself from continuing to spin up into whatever the next thing is, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. So you're trying to essentially anticipate the physical response that your body's gonna have when you're in that moment, right? And then you're coming up with sort of a game plan or a response plan so that if that feeling does surface, you are ready to not necessarily defend yourself against it, but hold space for yourself to feel it, but also overcome it and deal with it in that moment.
Perfect. I love that. Hold space for yourself to feel it. That's perfect, Steph, because I think we get in this loop so much with anxiety that if we try to feel like we defend ourselves against it, or we try to feel like we've got to stop ourselves from feeling anxious, realistically, what we're doing is we're almost hyper focusing ourselves on the fact that we're feeling anxious then.
Right.
Oh man, I'm feeling anxious. I can't feel anxious. I got to stop feeling anxious. Well, what are you doing? You're just in this loop in your head going, I'm feeling anxious, da 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 da. But if you can recognize that that's starting to come up, and then you can bring yourself back to the present moment, bring yourself back to here, because I always say anxiety lives in the future. Anxiety doesn't live in right now. Anxiety is a symptom of the thing that we're worried about that might happen, essentially.
Right.
And so if you can bring yourself back to here, to this moment, that will start to slow that response down. And there's a lot of biological, and I'm by no means a scientist, but there's a lot of biological research that goes into this too, that literally when you start feeling that anxiety, your body is starting to send that fight or flight response, starting to drop some norepinephrine from your brain and some adrenaline to your body, which starts to increase your heart rate. It starts to make your breathing shallower and faster. These are physiological responses that happen. And so once you start to recognize and learn that, hey, this is going on in me, and then you learn ways to intervene in that, then you can stop that physical response. And when that physical response starts to slow down, that sends a signal back to your brain that, hey, this is no longer a fight or flight situation. This is no longer a perilous situation. Then your thoughts can start to slow down. And then you can start to make a little more sense of it. And then you can try to start talking to yourself in a logical manner. I guess I guess the way probably a good analogy is you meaning people in general, you're probably not going to, if you just go jump off a cliff and halfway down the cliff start thinking about the fact that, oh, what's the logical things I need to do to make sure that I'm going to land okay, that's probably not going to end real well. And so if you're in the middle of that anxiety, if you're in the middle of that just spiraling and thoughts going and going and going, it's real hard to bring your logical brain back online to say, I know this is just anxiety. This is the only thing that's happening, so I shouldn't feel anxious, because that part of your brain, quite honestly, is kind of offline. The frontal cortex of your brain, when you start dumping norepinephrine and adrenaline, that starts, I don't want to say shutting down, but it starts going quieter. And like you guys have probably both heard the term like the reptile brain, that part, that starts taking charge. And so you can tell yourself, this is just anxiety. I shouldn't feel anxious. But that part of your brain's kind of not really there. It's not really doing anything at that point. So you've got to get that part back online. You've got to get yourself some space. You've got to bring yourself back into this moment right now before you can have that conversation with yourself of, this is just anxiety and this is why I shouldn't feel anxious because of X, Y, Z.
Right.
Because I've done this before, or because I've prepared for this, or whatever the case may be.
Wow. That's wow. So is that kind of what people mean when they say like you can't think your way through an anxious episode? Like kind
Yes,
of okay.
yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going to take credit for this saying because I got it from a book that I read, and someone who I think it's one of the best people in the field for anxiety. His name's Dr. Russell Kennedy. Excuse me, Dr. Russell Kennedy. And the way he puts it is you can't think your way out of a feeling problem because
Right.
anxiety ultimately is a feeling. And so you can't really logically think your way out of it because following the neuroscience of it, that logical part of your brain is significantly blunted when you are anxious like that. So if
Okay.
you're trying to tell yourself logically this is not a problem when that logical part of your brain's taking a nap during that time.
Right. So you're just it's a matter of shifting the energy and
Yes.
shifting the feelings and pulling yourself back to a place where you feel safe.
Yes, yes. And for me, that always is in this present moment. And I could go real
Yes.
woo-woo there because I have a lot of my own stuff
Oh, I
around
love this
spirituality and
stuff.
those sorts of things. But it really is. Let me give you an example. For a long time with my anxiety, where it started manifesting was I'd be feeling pretty decent overall, but I'd wake up in the middle of the night and then I feel my heart beating, my heart racing, and then my mind would start going, "Oh, am I having a heart attack? What's going on?" So on and so forth, these type of things. Because of
Mhm.
course, I'm an old man at 47. As far as how that 13-year-old inside of me sees me. So bringing yourself into the present moment, something that I learned to do, and this is just an example, but this is a great example, is if I were to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and my mind's racing and those thoughts are going crazy, what I try to do is I try to really focus on, okay, what am I feeling? What are the physical sensations around me? Like in
Mm.
my bedroom, we always keep a ceiling fan going, and it's always a little chilly in our bedroom, so we sleep better like that. So I'd really focus on, oh, feel that cool air on my skin. And you feel that little bit of wind blowing there, you feel that feels cool. You feel what's going on there. And when I do that, then my brain stops going in this loop of, oh, I'm gonna have a heart attack. This is happening, this is happening, this is happening.
Right.
And then it starts to slow down. And when you're doing that, the same thing, it starts to slow down those physiological responses to where you're not pumping all this excess adrenaline and everything out. And then you get back to that more grounded place to where then you can not combat the anxiety, but where it's no longer affecting you like it was.
Right. And I love that you just said that because a big part of my own anxiety or my own journey with anxiety has been dealing with those 2 a.m. thoughts where I wake up and first it starts with, oh, I didn't get eggs today at Trader Joe's, or
Mhm,
oh, like I wonder if that formula in that Excel sheet that I built 3 days ago is actually gonna work. And
mhm.
then it would spiral into my boss hates me. I'm not going to be a good mom one day. I'm not even
Uh-huh.
met. Like it would just go absolutely crazy. And so what I've learned is instead of like trying to shut it down and tell that inner voice to shut up,
Mhm,
I started just getting out of bed because I didn't want to keep that anxiety in the bedroom. I wanted to like, move it outside for a minute. And
mhm,
I would journal on what I was feeling like, right then and there. I know it's 3 in the
mhm.
morning and I'm not gonna solve this shit at 3 AM, but,
Amen.
like, like, if I tried to go back to sleep with that, I wasn't gonna get a good night's sleep. So,
Mhm,
journal it out, and within 20 minutes, I was able to get back to a more grounded place and just fall
mhm.
right asleep. So,
Absolutely, that's awesome.
yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
You're right, you have to get that out. You have to be detached from those anxious thoughts. You've gotta get detached from those or it's just gonna run rampant. It's just gonna keep
Mhm.
going and going. And journaling, that is an awesome way to do that. There's actually a lot of, like, neuroscience research that shows that when you journal, it actually accesses a different part of your brain than when you just talk about something. So it actually
Right.
processes it through differently, and your mind literally that anxious part of your mind is literally seeing that you're acknowledging this and you're recognizing this and you're not just trying to push it away, you're not just trying to ignore it, and it seems to do
Right.
something. I don't think they know the science behind exactly how it chemically or whatever works, but it seems to do something to where it's different than just thinking about it.
Absolutely. And can you talk a little bit more about like why it's so I don't know if the right word is unhealthy, but why is it so damaging and why does it make it worse when we suppress
Okay.
anxiety or when we attempt to at least?
Okay. Excellent, excellent question. I always preface everything by saying, and it's funny if any of my clients ever hear this, they're going to roll their eyes and laugh because I always preface all these things by saying I don't have answers, I have responses. And once
Okay.
again, that's a nifty little quote I picked up from a spiritual teacher I think is really cool, and that just resonated with me when I heard it. But my response to that, the reason that it is so detrimental in my experience, myself and with clients, to try to repress that anxiety is, well, twofold. One, it's there for a reason. Ultimately, anxiety is there because it's trying to keep us safe. It's there because there's something that feels out of alignment, something that feels threatening to us. And that anxiety is trying to keep us safe. It might be misguided. It may be telling us we're going to have a heart attack if we give up and give a 5-minute speech, but it's trying to do that. So anxiety is not a bad thing in and of itself. Anxiety, go back 2 million years ago, anxiety is what kept us from getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. We would look around the corner as opposed to just walking out in the open. It's not a bad thing in and of itself. But I think where we get into trouble is that in 2024, we're not going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. But that part of our brain is still there. So it equates that to, I've got to give this speech at work, or I've got an annual review coming up at work. And oh, what if it goes bad? And then what if that means that I don't get a pay increase? And then my electric bill goes up and I can't pay my bills. And then my kids don't have food, and and just goes and goes and goes like that. So repressing it, from my experience, never works in the long term. It can feel like it does in the short term because I want to amend that. Some people say it can feel like it does in the short term. I've never experienced that. When I try to just ignore it and say it's not a thing, it seems to just grow. But some people say it makes it go away in the short term. But ultimately, the problem that you're doing with that is I think that you're just kicking the can down the road. You're really just like, let's use distraction because that's a good word. If I'm feeling really anxious about something and I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, if I just get up and I start scrolling through my phone because that's going to distract me from it, then that might theoretically make the anxiousness go away in that moment, but it isn't really fixing it. Does that make sense? It's kind of just distracting us, pulling us away from the thing that's there, but we're not really getting to the root cause of why we're feeling anxious. And that's a rabbit hole we could go down. But so repressing it is, I guess, the best way I can think to put it, and I talk in analogies a lot. I don't know why, but
I love it.
Yeah, I guess the best way I would put it is repressing your anxiety is kind of akin to putting a bandage on a bullet hole. It might temporarily help. It might slow down the bleeding. But if you don't get that bullet out and you don't really suture that thing up and you don't really get to the root cause of it, it's still going to come back up. It's still going to be an issue. You're just kind of temporarily putting something over it and masking it without ever really, quote unquote, fixing it or changing it for maybe a better way instead of saying fixing it.
Right.
So that's the first reason. I think the second reason that repressing anxiety, in my opinion, doesn't work is that there's something driving that anxiety, and there's a reason that we're feeling that, and we need to acknowledge what we're feeling, because if we don't, it can then manifest and come out in other, even less healthy ways. It's not unusual. I've worked with people that have struggled with anxiety and they just try to push it down and they try to push it down and they try to push it down. And what ends up happening is then they end up becoming a very disconnected person, to where they don't really, if you try to have a conversation about how someone's feeling, they don't really know. It's kind of hard to know how they're feeling because they're not really in touch with those feelings. Or it can manifest in a way of, okay, I become this really angry person. And I'm this really angry person, and I lash out at people. Yeah. And it seems like that comes from, well, because I'm feeling this anxiety and I've never really affected that anxiety. And so there's this part of me inside that feels like that it's not being taken care of, and it can kind of lash out then in a way. And it can be angry and it can feel like I'm not being protected, I'm not being taken care of, I'm not being recognized. And so forget the world, and I'm just going to be this angry person. And it's usually it's not something that consciously someone thinks of, but I've seen it happen multiple times.
Oh yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that trying to repress anxiety that doesn't work because the body it comes out in other ways. Because I believe Steph and I had kind of a similar discussion about this on another episode where I was talking about how humans and the body kind of tells on itself. We hide things.
Oh, yes.
Whether it's a secret, or whether it's we're just trying to repress our feelings or our anxiety, the body always tells on itself in some way. So it's just interesting that you brought that up, because I remember having this exact discussion.
I think last week, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, like I don't think we're designed to hold on to certain things for a certain amount of time. We just can't help it. And
I agree.
And I think it's actually healthy. It's kind of a self-regulating system, I guess, in a way. That we have to be cognizant and strong enough to understand it and deal with it. We can't just keep, as you say, kicking the can down the road. It is going to come out at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I love that. You're from my perspective, you're 100% right. And that kicking the can down the road or repressing it, I'm gonna veer a little woo-woo because that's the way I am on some things. What you really are doing in that, or let me rephrase, because I can only speak for myself. When I have done that in the past, and when I've tried to do that in the past, what I'm really doing is I'm telling that part of me that's anxious inside of me that, hey, you're not important, you don't matter. Something's making me feel anxious. It would be no different than if I was feeling really sad or really morose, or maybe I'd lost a loved one or someone. I don't want to feel that hurt of that pain of that, so I'm going to shove it down. What I'm really doing is I'm really telling that part of myself, you don't matter. I shouldn't feel you. You don't matter. You're not important. And the reason I say that, and the reason I'm so passionate about that, is because I think that from my perspective, as I've gotten older, and I by no means have this all figured out, I'm a perfectly infallible human being like we all are. or pardon me, perfectly fallible, wrong word. but what I've noticed for myself is that the more I can authentically let myself feel those things, the more I can authentically be me and own all of those parts of me, the more they just become a part of me and they don't become this all-encompassing thing. If that makes sense. For instance, when I was in the depth of my anxiety, when I was struggling the most with it, if you would ask me about it, I would have very likely, my response would have been that I'm an anxious person. It's just how I am. For years, I used to say, I'm like, if the average person walks around, their anxiety level is like a 2 or a 3. I'm like a 5 or 6. That's just how I am. It's how I'm wired. And there's some truth to that's how my energy is. I'm not going to dispute that by any means. But what am I telling myself by telling myself I'm just an anxious person? I'm not telling myself that I'm someone who's feeling anxious. I'm saying this is a core part of me. And it's good to feel that, but am I defining myself, and am I somehow then making myself, how do I put this? Am I somehow almost making it a self-fulfilling prophecy that now, well, I'm just an anxious person. That's just what I'm always going to be. And the reality is, yeah, I'll always have some anxiety because it's kind of, to an extent, it is how I'm wired. And like I said, though, anxiety is just an emotion. It isn't a negative thing. And so why should I be labeling myself as I'm an anxious person? Because that feels like it's a judgment against myself. And that doesn't feel good. I'm assuming if you were to sit here and tell yourself, Jay or Steph, you were to tell yourself, I'm just an overly emotional person, or I'm just too anxious, or I'm too that doesn't feel good. It doesn't really feel like we're really caring for ourselves. It feels like we're really kind of beating ourselves up about that. And how are we ever going to get to a point to where then we can look at ourselves and say, this is good, and I like me, and I love this part of me. And even with like anxiety, I love my anxiety because I know it's trying to keep me safe. Maybe it goes a little overboard sometimes, but I know where it's coming from. It's trying to keep me safe. It's not trying to make me miserable and make me not like my life. It sees some perceived threat there, and it's saying, let's protect you from this perceived threat. And so we can't repress that. We have to let ourselves feel those things, because that is a part of us. That's a part of what makes us the person that we are.
All right, well said.
And I stopped myself because, like I said, I can just go and go and go.
Oh no, I love it. I love it. I love it. So it's almost, would you say that And this might be a stretch, but I love to challenge myself to think like this.
Mhm.
Is it possible that our anxiety can be kind of a superpower, like in a way?
My gut instinct says yes. My logical brain that turns on goes, man, anxiety's caused me a lot of strife over the years. So I don't know if I want to look at that as a good thing, but which is contradictory to what I was just saying. But my gut instinct says yes, it kind of can be, because what it can do, if it can allow us then to potentially see things coming up that someone who doesn't ever feel that might not see. And that isn't it can go overboard. It can keep us from
Mm,
experiencing things in life. It can keep us from having a really, really full, rich life in some ways. But at the same time, though, me being the anxious person I am probably, and maybe this is a horrible example, but it's just the only example I can think of in my head. I'm probably not going to keel over tomorrow from a heart attack without knowing about it ahead of time, because every time I get some little twinge, I'm going to be like, oh, and then I better go check it out and figure out what's going on. So yeah, it can be a good thing. I think I
There you
would say
go.
it can be a superpower, much like I've heard it said before. I'm sure you have as well, like our ADD. I
Oh
think that
yeah.
absolutely can be a superpower. The same type of thing. I think that any emotion, any feeling that we have, in and of itself, is not a bad or not a good. It's all about how it affects our lives. And if it's affecting our life in a negative way, then that's when we need to look at it and try to change our relationship to that.
Right.
If it's not affecting our life in a negative way. If me being a little high strung and a little nervous means I anticipate some things, then maybe I get a little bit out ahead of the curve on some things. How's that bad? That's not a bad thing.
Right. I love that. And that kind of brings me to my next question is, there are a lot of people, hold on. Sorry, my dog is running around.
I'm surprised my cats haven't made an appearance yet.
Yeah.
So I totally get it.
Yeah. So damn, I just lost my train of thought. ADD.
I feel
Okay.
like
So I got it. Here we go. Wrapping up. So I've heard a lot of people say, anxiety is not real. Like, I've never dealt with it, so it's not real, blah, blah, blah. To which I would say, I feel like anxiety is something that every human has the capacity to feel. It just affects all of us in some of us to a higher degree, some of us to a smaller degree. So I think that if you're somebody who denies that anxiety exists, I would almost question, maybe you just haven't dealt with yours.
yeah, I don't think that's invalid, Steph. I think that anyone that says that I've never felt anxiety or I've never been anxious, my first question to that person would always be, well, what is anxiety to you? What does that mean then? Because do you mean
Right.
you've never had a panic attack? Okay, yeah, that's possibly the case.
Right.
But have you ever gotten nervous when you've had to go out on a first date with somebody you've never met before? That's minor anxiety. That's another variation
Right.
of that. So yeah, no, I think that's a very valid way to look at it. And I think that part of it comes down to the language and comes down to, how do I put this? It almost feels like comes down to people wanting to generalize something that's a very personal thing depending on how we experience it.
Yeah.
If someone
Right.
thinks they've never felt anxiety because they've never had a panic attack in the middle of a Target and had to leave the store because they thought they were going to pass out, that just means that they've never had a panic attack. That doesn't mean they've never had anxiety. But for you, that might not be anxiety provoking at all. For another person, that might be hugely anxiety provoking. So, what's our frame of reference? Are we talking about the same thing? Are we coming from the same place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like that's on the money, exactly what I was thinking. Um, and I think that like with any feeling that people don't experience, I almost wonder if part of the reason that so many people nowadays are saying that like, oh, anxiety is not real on one side is because on the other side, a lot of people might be characterizing like minor anxieties, and I say it in quotes because it may not be minor to them. But I think a lot of people in the online space, especially on social media, are claiming to have anxiety. Meanwhile, they haven't necessarily experienced anxiety disorder. They haven't been diagnosed with it. So I I wonder if the people that deny it are just reacting to this overuse of the terminology.
That's entirely possible, I would say. That reminds me an awful lot of there's some pushback I'm starting to see in social media now on neurodivergence and on
Oh
ADD
yeah.
and on ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and those sorts of things. People, I've and I could get on a soapbox about it, and I won't. But let's just say I have very strong feelings about people getting on social media and saying, "Oh, everybody's just neurodivergent now. That's ridiculous." When
Right.
it's like, no, that's not the appropriate way in my mind to respond to it. But that's what this feels
Absolutely.
like. What you're talking about with anxiety. If people are using the term as anxiety and saying, you know, oh, I'm feeling anxious or I have anxiety, yes, they very well could be. That doesn't mean that they are, according to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, the Psychological Manual DSM-5, that doesn't mean that they are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. But like I said, anxiety is an emotion. So yeah, they may very well be feeling anxiety. But I think it's kind of human nature that if I've never struggled with that personally, and obviously I have, but if I'm the person that's never struggled with that, and now I see everybody coming out of the woodwork, and it seems like everybody's got anxiety and everybody's anxious about everything, depending on my background, depending on my point of reference, and depending on a number of things, it might be hard for me to not go down that thought of, well, that's not even a real thing. Because everybody has it, so it just mustn't, it's not really anything. It's like, oh, that's no
Right.
different. That's just part of being human.
I guess
Well, yeah, anxiety is part of being human, but having an anxiety disorder where it makes it hard for you to leave the house, that's a little different. It's not the same thing.
I guess
Right.
sticking with that, I agree. You know, I do think some people kind of use a very expanded definition of what anxiety is.
Yes.
But I guess kind of what Steph was saying, that you know, people who deny that anxiety exists or say that they've never been anxious, I find are maybe not the same, but similar to people who denigrate the important or how should I say, downplay the importance of mental health. And you know, people say certain things don't exist, and in the worst case, you know, people who say that, you know, people who are anxious or people who go to a therapist or go to a counselor or want to do things to focus on their mental health or weak. And
Yeah.
I see that a lot. And I don't know if it's a generational thing, because you know, I guess certain people growing up, you know, certain families, you know, certain cultures, you just didn't talk about it because it was seen as a weakness, or you know, man up, you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
and deal with it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, do you see that a lot? Because you know, not just on social media, because it's there, but do you see that on social media? Do you see it, you know, in life, in your work, kind of that mindset?
I do. And there's so many things that play into that. I think that like some different cultural backgrounds can play into that. I think different economic backgrounds can play into that. I think, like you said, generational things can play into that. There's very much the generation, very broad blanket statement. I don't believe this 100%. But like the generation, let's say, just to use an example, the baby boomers, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's what you do. Even though that statement really doesn't make sense because you physically
Physically
can't pull
impossible.
yourself up by your bootstraps. It doesn't
It's
happen.
not possible physically.
If you can figure out how to do that, tell me. That'd be pretty cool. But you know,
I kind of want to try now, but
yeah,
I
I can
digress.
just see myself giving myself a concussion trying. So I think I'll
Seriously,
leave that
yes,
to you.
yes. Bust your head open.
No,
I'll end up in the hospital.
but no, I definitely see that in my practice. I see that there is that it's all of this stuff when it relates to mental health, whether we're talking about anxiety or we're talking about depression or anything, there's so much of it that's personal, and it really comes from what is your point of reference? What is that person's point of reference? if someone grew up in a household that we didn't talk about these things, these are just the things that you don't really discuss. For those of you, I think we do this just as an audio. I'm pointing at myself. We just don't talk about these things. Then it can be, if you don't get exposed to it some way, i.e. education is how I got exposed to it because I decided this is what I wanted to do for a career. It would be very easy, and I understand how it could seem like a foreign concept to think that these are really a thing that really cause people problems. Or maybe not even that they aren't, that it's something that really cause someone problems, but really having the language to label it and know what it means, you know? And so I think that's 100% true. I think that if you grew up in a household that the emotions that you saw were anger and happiness, then your point of reference is kind of that the emotions that exist are anger and happiness. If like for instance, you have
I feel so
a
seen.
parent, yeah, oh yeah, I speak from experience on that one, you know. But so if you never saw somebody who was feeling anxious or nervous, or they never expressed that, or they never talked about that, how are you going to have any connection to that? How are you going to understand that? Just like if your parents, if you grew up in a household that your parents didn't communicate well, what's your frame of reference on what a relationship looks like and communication in a relationship looks like?
Right.
Your frame of reference is kind of that, well, people just kind of don't talk. They say, hi, how was your day? And then they get in an argument about something. I guess that's what communication is. It's the same thing with anxiety. It's the same thing with depression. If we don't have these behaviors, if we don't have either these conversations or we don't have these behaviors modeled to us, we're kind of shooting in the dark. And so then if we have parents that say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or big boys don't cry, or whatever the case may be, and we don't have anything else that shows us that there's other ways to do it, then that's our point of our frame of reference, and that's what we're going to think is how it's supposed to be. So then when someone says, I'm feeling really anxious, I know, man, we were going to go out tonight, we were all going to go out to the club, and we were going to have fun, but man, my anxiety is really high and I just can't do it tonight. It's going to be hard for someone who doesn't understand that, or came from that background of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, to not go to that place of, oh, come on, man, you can come out. What are you talking about? What do you mean anxiety? It's because they don't have a frame of reference on that. And that's where things like this podcast, I think, can be so helpful, is to get people that knowledge and that reference point of, it does exist, it is real. And just because you haven't experienced it the same way I have, doesn't mean that yours is right or mine is wrong, or vice versa.
It just is what it is.
Exactly, it is. That's probably the two easiest ways to encapsulate that, is that, is anxiety good? Is anxiety bad? Is anxiety harmful? Is anxiety helpful? Anxiety just is. And then it's just a matter of how it affects our lives.
Wow. So
did that answer your question, Jay? I know I'm super good at just like going and all over the place. So did that answer your question?
Absolutely, because I mean, you're absolutely right. These people who deny the importance of having good mental health, and people who deny that anxiety exists, or put yourself up by your bootstraps, man up, all these people, like, you're right. The only emotions they typically show are anger and happiness, and it's just, it's interesting when you see them, because like we said before, you can't repress all this. It's going to come out at some point. So and you don't control when it comes out. But it's interesting when I see it happen, because like, wow, you sounds like you need a hug or something. It's just
oh yeah, absolutely. I hear you, man. I'm right there.
Like you and your inner child might want to have a talk.
Yeah, 100%.
If you can find your inner child, you might want to.
Yeah, you may need some help doing that. But yeah, you're right. It's that's so true. And the more science progresses, and the more neurology and neuroscience progresses, and the more they're finding more and more out about the mind-body connection. And I'm not going to go on a super nerdy tangent here, because I could, but I won't. But the more finding out that, as you said, those things have to come out. And so if you're the person that the only emotions that you know how to express, and the only ones you know how to let out are anger and or happiness, and that's all you've got, and you walk around and you repress and you carry around this depression that's so deep in you, you don't realize it's there, or you carry around this anxiety that's so deep in you and you don't realize that it's an anxiety and you don't know what to do with it, what do you think it's doing to your body? If your body is constantly in this fight or flight state, but you don't know how to name it, you don't know what it is, and you don't know what to do with it. What are the long-term implications of your body having all this adrenaline flowing through your system all the time? I mean, there's research starting to come out now. I'm going to totally forget the title of it because that's what my ADD brain does. But there's an amazingly good book out that talks about the mind-body connection related to this. I will find it before we get off the call. I'll grab it off my bookshelf. That talks about, I'll preface it by saying correlation, not causation, because that's fair to say. But people who repress emotions, there's higher incidences of cancer in people like that. There's higher incidences of heart disease, cardiovascular disease, all of these things, because it affects your body. If you're walking around in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn all day, where you've got these chemicals running through your body, it's going to affect you. If your body's dumping adrenaline into your system every day, where it's increasing your heart rate and it's slowing down, and it's increasing your heart rate and slowing down, that's not an analog to I'm going to the gym and I'm running on a treadmill and then I'm resting. No, what you're doing is you're making that part of your body work that much harder more frequently, and it can have effects in the long term.
Is it possibly your body keeps the score?
It is, yes. Well, actually, that's not the book I was thinking of. That actually isn't the book I was thinking of. Sorry, I misunderstood what you were asking. Your body does keep the score, but that is actually an excellent book for that as well. That's not the exact one I was thinking of, but I just actually be reading that myself. And that is an excellent book that talks about that and talks about that mind-body connection. It goes a little more on the trauma end of things, which I've also am hugely interested in, but it does cover a lot of that related to the physical/mental connection and how one affects the other.
Okay, that's like next. I'm currently reading Be Here Now by Ram Dass.
Ram Dass.
So good. I'm only on page 8. I'm obsessed. I can't wait to get into it. But The Body Keeps the Score is next for me.
That's a great book. And let me actually give me 1 second. I'm going to find that book on my bookshelf because that's not the one I was thinking of. It's an incredibly good book. And I wanted to give it to everybody because I know it's a good shoot.
Awesome.
It looks like it's probably on my nightstand and not on my bookshelf.
It's okay. We'll put it in the show notes.
I will make sure we get it. Absolutely.
Awesome. So as you're talking, I'm kind of thinking, now that there's this conversation around mental health that's like so front and center, that was definitely not prevalent in my parents' day and age, in their parents' day and age. Is it possible that the reason that we're feeling so much anxiety surface and so much anxiety as a generation, is this the generation where we feel generational trauma and we're going through this reckoning with everything that our grandparents and our parents have carried down and not dealt with? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to that. I by no means gonna say that I know for sure, but I think there's something to that because I think that we're hitting this interesting almost tipping point of we've had past generations that didn't talk about this stuff. Either they didn't know how to, or they felt ashamed to, or whatever the case was. And now we're hitting a point where we've got, to not sound really stereotypical, but we've got social media. So everything's out there all the time. Then we're starting to hit this point now that we're hitting, it's almost a place of kind of like nothing's off the table or nothing's out of bounds. And so then what's happening with that then is we have a lot of people, I think, that are starting to be exposed to some of these things, and we don't really know what to do with it because of that generational part of my parents never worked through that. They never talked through that. And so that affected how they, and this isn't blaming my parents, and I'm using mine as a specific example, but that isn't, if they didn't know how to work through those things, then that's absolutely going to affect their relationship with me. That's absolutely going to affect how they operate in the world on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to see that. And then that's going to affect me as well, because I see that as my benchmark and my thing, and this is what you do. And so then that's kind of repeating what I said earlier. But so then we get this tipping point where now everything's on the table and there's all these things out there in the world. and we hear people talking about it and we don't know what to do with it. We don't even know where to begin, how to start it, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. So maybe next generation fixes it.
Yeah,
I don't
but I
know.
think we've got a
Well,
possibility to do it.
I think it's kind of yes. I think before
Yeah,
we can fix something, we have to acknowledge that there is actually
Right.
that it's there.
but I think we this generation is doing it. I think we're seeing we're saying, hey, my grandparents and parents didn't talk about this, but
Mhm.
instead of saying, well, this is how it always is, this is how it will be, we're saying, well, let me see if there's a different way.
Yes.
I think where that right there is very, very important for the simple fact that mom, grandmom, great grandma, they didn't do it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's
You are dead on,
it's
Jay.
kept that second along. So I think the fact that we're even recognizing it and acknowledging it and just asking the question that, hey, is there not even a better way? Is there a different way?
Mhm.
I think is key. And I think, you know, I think, with social media and with technology, with advances in medicine, I think it's, there's going to be an acceleration, not just from recognizing trauma, but healing trauma. And I think
Mhm.
you do see people. I have so many friends who are saying, I'm on my healing journey. Like that's a thing. I don't know if
Same.
yeah,
Oh
I
yeah,
don't
me
know if
too.
30 years ago, 40 years ago, that's a thing. I think they look at you crazy, but that's not actual thing right now. And I think it's something that, so many people need. It's funny. I'm not sure how familiar you are with George Carlin, the late great George Carlin, but
Oh,
he had a skit where
my all-time favorite stand-up comedian.
yes,
I've got all of his HBO specials on video.
I
Love
love
it.
him. But he had a skit where he talks about, there was a condition called shell shock, and then
Mhm.
eventually it became, shell shock was too strong, so it became battle fatigue, and then it became post traumatic stress disorder. And his
Mhm.
point was that if he had simply called it or kept calling it shell shock, you might have seen a lot of those soldiers get the help that they need.
Mhm.
I don't know if I would go that, that far, but I do think if we, see things for what they are and stop trying to repress things, not just say man up or whatever, you
Mhm.
might have, we maybe would have had 3 or 4 generations of recognizing trauma and dealing with it so that we'd be here in a much, we'd have so many healthier parents and grandparents and great grandparents and children. But we didn't have it. We just kind of swept it under the rug. We thought, you know, you'll grow out of it or walk it,
Walk it off,
rub dirt
exactly.
on it or something. It's like, I can't
Yeah.
rub dirt on my brain. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's like telling
Like,
somebody to walk it off if they just got shot in the leg. Walk it off. It'll be
yeah,
okay.
like,
That
I
doesn't
can't,
work.
yeah,
That,
like I
that
can't
doesn't
walk
work.
off this feeling that there are pins in my brain. That's not how that works.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're right, and I love that, Jay, because that your perspective on that, I agree with you 100%. And it feels to me when I hear you say that, the first feeling I get is I get this feeling of optimism that we are doing the work now. We may not get there, we may not perfect it, but then you can always have the philosophical discussion of what does it mean to even get there, you know? But you're
Right.
right. If we were to go probably to any one of our parents, if it was my dad, Steph's mom, and your dad back when they were our age having this conversation, this wouldn't exist. You know,
Right.
that it literally wouldn't happen. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation on a podcast right now, a generation ago, my parents, you wouldn't be talking in public about the fact that you struggled with anxiety because that just, you don't
Right.
want people to know that. So I think we are doing
Right.
the work. I think you're 100% right. And the more we
Right.
have conversations like this, I think you're you're accurate that it's going to accelerate our way on how we learn different ways to cope with it, different ways to deal with it, or different ways to just approach it and look at it. Maybe it's not even that we learn to cope with it. Maybe we just learn, because to me, when I hear cope, it almost makes it sounds like a negative, like, oh, I've just got to deal with this. Maybe it's just
Mhm.
we change our whole point of reference on what it is and to not go too head in the clouds. We change our whole point of reference on what it is to be human. And hey, sometimes we're going to feel anxious. Sometimes we're going to feel depressed. And that's okay. As long as we don't get caught in those, as long as we don't get lost in those, isn't that part of what makes life life?
Wow.
Yeah.
How would we ever know? How would we ever feel happy if we never feel sad? If you don't have a
Exactly.
point of reference that you're sad, then how are you ever going to know you're happy? You just kind of are.
I
Yeah.
think about this all the time.
So let me ask you this
Yes.
real quick, Ben, because you actually just kind of mentioned, what does getting there look like? Do you think that, getting there, whatever it is more of a journey versus an actual destination?
Yes, 100%. I think that my point of reference on that is that this is all a journey. It completely is. And I think that this goes back to what I talked about earlier about being present in this present moment. That's a little redundant, but being present. I think that the more we can see this as a journey, the more we can lean into that, the more that we can recognize that we're going to have good times, we're going to have bad times, we're going to have ups and we're going to have downs, and just get to the place that we recognize that that's natural and that's the way it is, the less it's going to carry a long-lasting, huge weight of an impact that's going to overwhelm us for long periods of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
1,000%.
I'm being a little. I feel like I'm a little vague there, and I'd like to drill down a little. I'm not quite sure. I'm struggling with drilling down a little bit more specific there.
No, I understand, but I mean, feel free to drill down.
I know. I think I probably would just be restating what I've already said. But so I will just say
Okay.
yes. I think it's very much a journey, and I think the ups and downs are part of that journey. And I think that maybe our evolution as people and of accepting, pardon me, people that have accepting struggles with mental health or accepting whatever struggles, the more we get to the point of recognizing that's just part of life, the less stigma it's going to carry and the less negative impact it's going to have. I really truly
I
believe
love that.
Same.
Wow. Well,
And I
now that
mean,
we've basically healed the world of anxiety, um, I mean, I could talk to you about this all day, Ben, and I know that we're gonna have to have a part two either on this podcast or one of my other 5,000 podcasts. Because
I would love it.
um, but we are just about at that time where we ask you to plug anything that you're working on. Give it.
Okay.
Well, before we even do that, do you have any last thoughts before we close out the conversation?
Okay, awesome. So, yes, I've got about a million going on in my head because my ADD
Same.
brain saying, "Don't forget this, don't forget that." But I think what I would say, and it's gonna sound very kind of silly or kumbaya, and for some reason I feel like I have to preface it. But I think what I would say if I had one message for people to take home from this, it's that it's okay to just authentically be you, and it's okay to feel these things, and there's nothing wrong with you if you're feeling these things. If you're struggling with anxiety, that doesn't mean you're a broken person. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. That means you're struggling with anxiety. If you struggle with anger, that means you're struggling with anger. But it doesn't have to define you, and it doesn't even begin to encapsulate the all of you. So if you can get to that point of just recognizing that this is part of the authenticity of me as a human being, this is part of the human condition, it can make so much of this stuff feel so much easier because you're not trying to fix something, because you're just recognizing that, hey, this is just part of my journey.
Beautiful. And is there anything that was wow. And this is exactly the therapy session that I needed tonight. I don't know about you, Jay. But okay, so I know you have a podcast, and I know that you do offer online counseling.
100%, yes. So if people want to find me, that's probably the easiest thing to do if they wanted to reach out to me anyway. My podcast is Diary of an Anxious Therapist. It's on pretty much every podcasting platform out there.
It's so good.
I use rss.com, and they feed it to whoever they feed it to. So I know it goes to a lot of different podcast networks. So they can find me there. Social media wise, I am on Instagram and I'm on Threads at Benjamin France LPC. Theoretically, I'm on TikTok at Benjamin France underscore LPC, but I'm not real active on there because it's real hard for me to do, as you probably noticed today, a 60-second video because I'm pretty chatty. And people can always find me at my website at benjaminfrance.com as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the Stay Introverted podcast. I can't even believe that this is your first guest appearance. Like, you killed it.
I can't believe that it's been an hour and 10 minutes already. I feel like we just started talking. It's
I
crazy.
know. I'm like, I don't want it to end, but unfortunately, I have to go take care of the dogs.
What you do? He's adorable.
Yeah.
Gotta make sure he's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I do. He's been having the zoomies the entire conversation. I'm like, stop it. Stop it. Anyway, if you guys love this episode, be sure to like it, rate it, review it, share it with a friend, and yeah.
Okay.
Stay introverted.
Thank you guys. I really love this and I really appreciate you both and I love listening to the podcast. So thank you for having me on.
Thank
Absolutely.
you for being on. We definitely appreciate it. And yes, like Steph said, like, rate, review. And as always, stay introverted and we will check you later. Bye.
Awesome.